Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Here we go. So I'm putting up on the screen Pirkei Avot, chapter 6, Mishnah number 9, which is where we were last week, but we're going to do a little recap because we didn't actually finish it before we do 10 and 11. So we are looking at a statement by one Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma, to whom not many rabbinic statements are attributed. And just remembering the setup here, he tells it by way of an anecdote that he was walking along and he receives this lovely invitation to come and live in a new community. I am from a great city of sages and scribes, is Yossi ben Kisma's response. Oh, wow, what an attractive prospect for our community. We are a bunch of unlearned but very rich people, and we would like to bring you, Rabbi, to live among us. And the response is, my son, even if you were to give me all the silver and gold, precious stones and pearls that are in the world, I would not dwell anywhere except in a place of Torah. For when a man passes away, there accompany him neither gold nor silver, nor precious stones nor pearls, but Torah and good deeds alone. And then there are the proof texts. So that's the text that we're studying. Again, we're kind of reaching this literary climax to everything that Pirkei Avot has been trying to say from chapter 1. You will recall, chapter 1 begins with the lineage of Torah from Moses at Mount Sinai to Joshua to the men of the Great Assembly, to the Sanhedrin, to the rabbis themselves, right? Saying we are here to communicate a lineage of Torah that began at Sinai. And we, the rabbis, are now the guardians, the custodians of this sacred heritage. And it's our job to pass it on to the next generation of sages and teachers, which is why if you are studying Pirkei Avot in this very consistent weekly format and looking at not just the micro, but also the macro, like what's the big architecture of this suite of teachings, even though they come from disparate individual voices, disparate sources, disparate communities, and even if, as we have noted, the scholarly consensus is that chapter 6 is itself not even original to the 5-chapter construction of Pirkei Avot, but rather is a kind of extra Mishnaic chapter that was appended to Pirkei Avot as an appendix or an addendum. Even with all of that, you start to notice big arcs of meaning that are being constructed. The most overarching of which I would submit is the heritage of Torah that began at Sinai and the preciousness of that heritage, that legacy that now is being entrusted to a new generation of scholars and rabbis. This is a book by rabbis for rabbis. And so we are kind of leading to the climax of the charge that is being delivered from one rabbinic community to the next generation of young rabbis in training. Take hold of this treasure and remember it is the greatest treasure of your life. Interesting also that it's not just Torah, that it is coupled with mitzvot. So it's not just abstract scholarship for its own sake may be valuable. And at times in Pirkei Avot, the value of Torah, what's called Torah lishma, Torah for its own sake, is noted in Pirkei Avot. But even better, much better indeed, is a life of Torah coupled with a life of mitzvot. Those are the two pillars on which Jewish life stands. That's the message. A bit of a side note, by the way, maybe it's just because Kelly's out of town for a few weeks performing, but I have taken upon myself a project in the month of December of listening to all of Beethoven's piano sonatas in order. I know a few of them, like some of them have names, like because they became so popular that they were given nicknames like the Moonlight Sonata, which is number 14, or the Appassionata Sonata. So some of these you may know, the Hammerklavier Sonata, some of these you may know, but I've never actually taken the time to listen to all of them in sequence. And it really is an extraordinary thing when you start to realize, like, yes, they stand as discrete units, but the fact that they are the product of a single mind allows you to explore the greater architecture of what, over the better part of 30 years, the composer was trying to communicate. I don't want to say much more because I think it's something you might want to try for yourself. And it reminded me of what we're doing in Pirkei Avot, that in hindsight, we now begin to see the way in which many of the themes actually have been recurring like motifs. And you see how they get developed across much time and much literature. So anyway, just a little food for thought. There are 32 mature piano sonatas that Beethoven composed, in addition to 3 that are not usually collected alongside them, that I haven't listened to, that he wrote when he was 13, but were not published at the time. So maybe I'll go back and listen to those as like chapter 6 coda of Pirkei Avot, the juvenile sonatas of Beethoven. But generally, a collection of his sonatas is 32 in number. And by the way, I'm listening to lots of different recordings instead of just one pianist, because every pianist provides a different interpretation. So anyway, that's my December project. I recommend that either you have a spouse who can tolerate loud music in the house, or a good pair of headphones, or that your spouse goes out of town for a few weeks while you do this. So people say, Rabbi, when do you have the time for this? And don't ask that question. You make time for the things that you consider important. So I'm making breakfast, Beethoven. I'm doing yoga, Beethoven. I'm getting ready for bed, more Beethoven. That's how it works. Okay. Thank you for indulging that little sharing. All right, so here we are with Yossi ben Kisma, and the premise that he will not live in a city where there is not Torah. Torah and good deeds alone are what accompany a person when one dies. And then there are the proof texts. When you walk, it will lead you. When you lie down, it will watch over you. When you are awake, it will talk with you, which the rabbis take to mean not only the embodied physical, this world acts of being awake, going to bed, waking up the next day, but as we said before, when you walk, that's your lifespan. When you lie down is the sleep of death. And when you awake is the resurrection. For those of you who have studied my class on afterlife concepts in Judaism, you know that the rabbis actually embrace notions of a hereafter that at times even includes bodily resurrection. So that's the interpretation here. When you walk, it will lead you in this world. When you lie down, it will watch over you in the grave. And when you are awake, again, it will talk with you in the world to come. So fascinatingly, they have this idea that Torah and good deeds, Torah and mitzvot, have a kind of longevity that is much greater than the project of our living days, right? Our 80, 90, 100, please God, up to 120 years of life. May we all live to see it in good health. Torah and mitzvot outlast that. And we talked about this a little bit last week. Perhaps one might simply say, from a logical standpoint, this is a poetic way of talking about the reputational benefit of a life of Torah and good deeds, right? When I eulogize people, I rarely focus on how much money they made. I often focus on their Torah and good deeds, for lack of a better way of putting it. In sum, right, what do you want recorded about you? What would you like the message to be spoken about you after you die? Would it not be that we dedicated ourselves to a life of Torah and mitzvot? I think that one could do a whole lot worse. And then, of course, in the world to come, well, that's a rabbinic faith precept that we have discussed at quite some length. They would like to encourage their readers to believe that Torah and mitzvot have a staying power even in the next realm. And there are many midrashim, there's much rabbinic folklore that actually talks about what is this olam haba going to be like? You know, I guess that if if the rabbis had been more hedonistic, they would have depicted the world to come as a, like, Club Med. But that's not how they depict it. In most of the midrashim that describe the world to come, God is sitting with an open volume of Talmud, teaching the disciples, right? So our spirit selves, or our olam haba incarnations, will be sitting around, and God is the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the academy, and we are God's pupils. And what do? All day long, we learn Torah. That's Jewish heaven. Sign me up. I don't know. I'm still tempted by Club Med, I gotta say. Not sure. I might be the guy who says, oh, come on, man. I did this for 120 years while I was alive. More Torah study. No, I think that it's pretty great. As I think I enjoy this. So what we didn't get to last week was the final proof text. And thus it is written in the book of Psalms by David, king of Israel. That is, of course, the traditional framework for the book of Psalms, that it is attributed to David Melech Yisrael, Chai Chai V'Kayam. I prefer the teaching you proclaimed to thousands of pieces of gold and silver. That is Psalms 119:72. Remember, this is just a nice way of saying, hey, look in the Tanakh, look in the Holy Scripture, look in the book of Psalms written by none other than King David, inspired by the very, voice of God. I prefer the teaching you proclaim to thousands of pieces of gold and silver. Yossi ben Kisma has the perfect proof text. That's exactly what he's saying to this nice invitation to come and live in a, let us say, less scholarly community, but with every material opportunity open to him. He says, no, thank you, Torah and mitzvot for me. And a second proof text, it says, mine is the silver and mine the gold, says Adonai Tzevaot, the Lord of hosts. Mine is the silver and mine the gold, saying the Lord of hosts. Now, lots of different ways of understanding that text, but if you click here on the proof text, you can see in the side panel the way in which it is framed, which is, V'hirashti et kol hagoyim, I will shake all the nations, and the precious things of all the nations shall come here, and I will fill this house with glory, said the Lord of hosts. By the way, you may know this text the way it is set in the libretto of Messiah, by Handel. Very, very seasonal reference here. I think that the Westchester Chorale or the Westchester Choir is actually singing this at Hitchcock Church. Maybe it was last weekend, maybe it's this coming weekend. It's the baritone aria, and I will shake the Lord, saying, I will shake all the nations. So this great disruption in the time of the messianic redemption, I will shake all the nations. I will fill this house with glory. Silver is mine and gold is mine, says the Lord of hosts. The glory of this latter house shall be greater than that. So this is really interesting. This verse seems to come out of nowhere. What does it mean that silver and gold belong to God? I'll give you my interpretation, which is that in the sight of God, the things that human beings value, the things that we consider truly precious, are completely inconsequential. Like, this is a God who owns the world, a God who can shake nations, a God who can do anything, a God whose glory is enshrined forever. Silver and gold, like, it's all mine anyway. I own all of it. These things, these fleeting things on which you pitiful little frail humans place such inordinate value, are like tinker toys to me, the Lord of hosts. That's one way of understanding it. That certainly is a way of understanding it that is consistent with the teaching of Yossi ben Kisma, who says, I will not live any place, no matter how much you give me in material remuneration, except a place of Torah mitzvah. Judy Gross, you're going to take the first comment on this Mishnah before we proceed.
Well, this follows the 7 qualities of a righteous person, and one of them being wealth. This proves that wealth is not the ultimate goal of a truly righteous person. Ultimately, it's that's not what you're aiming for. You're aiming the gold and silver are not what.
That's right.
Anyway.
That's right. And remember, in antiquity, up until really very, very recently, up until the dawn of modernity, up until the 19th century, not long after the Enlightenment, The rabbinate is not a paid profession. So there are many teachings in Avot about the challenges that rabbis may face in so thoroughly dedicating themselves to a life of Torah and mitzvot, of teaching and judging, of being available to their community as a guide, an exponent, and an exemplar. Material remuneration is not among them. And while on the one hand, and we've said this, the rabbis of Pirkei Avot do not spurn entirely the necessity of making a living, they make it clear that ultimate value does not reside in that which can be counted in a bank account. Thank you for that. Steve Maskett.
The thing I find interesting about this text is that the rabbi who's responding to this, to the citizen of some place, is not interested in spreading Torah. Is not interested. It seems like there was a period of time where Torah did spread. It spread to Alexandria. It spread, it was all over. It moved, but somehow this is written at a time where maybe they're trying to say, we are where we are. We're not going anywhere else. I don't know.
Right. So Yossi ben Kisma is not saying, what a great opportunity. I'm going to go to this heathen community like Chabad, right? And I have something wonderful to share with the community, as opposed to, can I really live in this place? Can I really live in a place that doesn't value Torah? Did I tell you the story of when Kelly and I were looking for a house about, I don't know, well, we started in November of 2013. So a few years after I had accepted the role of senior rabbi in the congregation, we decided we wanted to move a little bit closer to WRT. So we live right on the border of Scarsdale in beautiful White Plains right now. There, you can see out the window. It's a lovely day here. I'm a block from Scarsdale. So we decided to move from our condo in the Fleetwood area of Bronxville. And we chose a place in White Plains, but we really looked for a very long time, the better part of a year. And our realtor, who was a member of the congregation at the time, who has since moved upstate, had this wonderful phrase. Any house she would show Kelly or me, she would say, "Can the rabbi live here?" There was so much in that statement. Was that a comment about who are your neighbors? Was it a comment about, is the house nice enough without being ostentatious, but modest enough without being a hovel? That was sort of like, I think there was a lot in there. But can the rabbi live here? And, not remembering the statement by Yossi ben Kisma at the time, a great retort would have been, is this a place of Torah and mitzvot? And on that front, we did very, very well, because my next door neighbor on this side is Rabbi Shira Milgram. And at the time, our across the street neighbor was Cantor George Mordecai of Temple Israel Center. So we actually had Kol Ami, Temple Israel Center, and my next door neighbor on the other side is a board member at Beit Am Shalom. I live down the street from Shai Held, who's the founding rabbi of Hadar, the brilliant Torah teacher. He was our scholar in residence a few years ago. He lives right down the street. Half a mile away is Rabbi Menachem Creditor, who's another brilliant rabbi, and who is the scholar in residence at UJA Federation of New York. Around the block is Rabbi Les Bronstein and Cantor Benji Ellen Schiller. So Yossi ben Kisma would have come to this address. He would have said, yes, this is a great community in which a rabbi can live. But Kelly and I often joke about that. Can the rabbi live here? Mom and Dad, do you want to unmute, please?
This is sort of an aside, but it strikes me as sort of disingenuous coming from King David to say, well, jewels, they don't mean anything to me.
Yeah, fair. Right. And this is, King David, yeah, that's a very trenchant observation and funny too. David, the David of Jewish myth, and I always use myth as an honorific term and not a disparaging term, not a diminishing term. Myth with a capital M, meaning the master story of our people. So David, not only in the Tanakh itself, the stories about David, but also the way in which David is built up to be this super heroic, almost semi-divine figure, is a really complicated dude. Because on the one hand, there's this origin story in the Tanakh itself about the chosen one of God who usurps Saul from the throne, who becomes God's elect, who is able to fell a 10-foot tall Philistine warrior, Goliath. This is also the same David who sends a Hittite soldier to the front lines where he is sure to die and engineers that so that he can steal his wife Bathsheba. This is also the King David who violently suppresses rebellions that attempt by his own children, and despite his wishes actually ends up killing Absalom. This is the same David whom later tradition would ascribe to be the author of the book of Psalms and a musician and a poet, the sweet singer of Israel. And there are Psalms, by the way, that say li David in the first line, which could mean by David, could also mean for David, could also mean of David, meaning in the style of David, could actually have nothing to do with David, could mean from the Davidic court, or could simply mean traditionally we associate these songs with David. Nevertheless, there's a very long storied tradition around David, the sweet singer of Israel. But yeah, I mean, he was a monarch who lived in the best property in all of Jerusalem, who probably did not spurn silver and gold in his actual existence as king of Israel. So yes, the irony is rich. Thank you. Audrey. Oh, you have to, yeah, there you go.
Okay, I put this in the chat, but at the time that this was written, what did the rabbis think of the kings, the Israeli kings? Like, and how come everything, I mean, you know, we've talked about David before, you and I, but everything is the house of David, and the Messiah will come from the house of David, and yet
Right.
I don't think personally, he's not admirable to me, but
Right.
that's.
So there are a few different answers to this. I think I'll try and tackle this in kind of chronological order. It's a really good question. The Tanakh itself, the Bible itself, has much to say about kings in general and about King David specifically. On the one hand, there is a consistent theme throughout the section of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, known in the scholarly community as the Deuteronomistic history. So a word on that. The book of Deuteronomy is of a piece in terms of chronology, era of composition, thematic consistency, global outlook, theology, cosmology, views on the priesthood, with several other subsequent books of the Tanakh. So we think of Deuteronomy as the fifth and final book of the Torah, better known as, well, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, which are presented to you in shul as a chumash, like a 5-book Torah commentary. Torah in book form is a chumash, which just comes from the Hebrew word chamesh, meaning 5. So the 5. In Greek, the Pentateuch, which means 5 books. But Tanakh is the full 26 books of the Hebrew Bible, right? We've talked about Tanakh being Torah, prophets, and writings. Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. Tanakh, it's an acronym. Actually, Deuteronomy may have more in common with the several books that come after it, at least in terms of era of composition, authorship, global outlook, cosmology, theology, and so forth, than Deuteronomy has with the 4 books with which it is presented. So don't be fooled by the fact that a Torah scroll makes it look as if you've got 5 sequential books that are a unit intended to be presented together. That is a bit of a forced effort. Originally, many people believe Deuteronomy was part of the later books. So Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings are the part of the Torah that are sometimes called in the scholarly community as the Deuteronomistic history. And that whole set of the Torah is really, among many other things, about the Israelite monarchy. And as early as, I shouldn't say as early, I mean sequentially, not necessarily chronologically, because if this is all being composed somewhere between the 7th century BCE and the end of the 6th century BCE, so over 100 or 200 years in the 7th and 6th centuries, including the Babylonian exile, you have this long, like mythical history of the period of Israelite narrative story that is about the succession from Moses to Joshua, Joshua to the judges, who don't think of like the Supreme Court. Judges were like tribal chieftains or warlords, to the kings, first as a united monarchy and then a split monarchy, north and south, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. All of that section is of a type. And by the way, just one fun aside, there are some scholars who believe that originally Joshua was supposed to be compiled alongside with the first 5 books of Moses, so that some scholars refer to a hexateuch, the 6 books of Moses, where Joshua actually, it's more than just, Joshua is the direct continuation of what happens after Deuteronomy. So that section, I would say, is on the one hand highly skeptical of and critical of the Israelite monarchy. I mean, famously, the book of Deuteronomy says, if the people come to you and say, we want a king, you may in fact appoint a king. This is God speaking to Moses. But that's hardly a full-throated endorsement of the monarchy as a whole. And the prophet Samuel, who is the prophet to anoint the first king, Saul, really doesn't want to do it. He has all sorts of legitimate reasons why this is bad for the Jewish people. I mean, everything from the power that the king will hold will corrupt him, the wealth, the fact that he will accumulate, and the book of Deuteronomy echoes these themes. You don't do it, the king is going to accumulate a stable of horses, a harem of women, and a treasury of money that's going to empower this king to be much more powerful than any Israelite should be. The only true authority is God. And that's a theme.
Okay.
And within that cautionary construct, the Deuteronomistic history, these several books of Torah, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, make it clear that we can't erase the facts on the ground. There is an awareness that Israel was ruled by kings for many, many generations, centuries even. And certain kings did well, but most of them did not. And the only legitimate kings ruled in Jerusalem, not the kings of the north. So there is a systematic effort of the Deuteronomistic history to delegitimize the kings in the north, Jeroboam, and all of Ahab. I mean, Ahab's a great example, not Moby Dick Ahab, but there's a reason Melville uses that name. I mean, Ahab is like the baddest of the bad. He in league with his wife Jezebel. Like, they are just one bad guy after another, one absolute corrupt failure of a monarch after another, with 3 notable exceptions, all of whom are Judean kings, meaning they ruled in the south. There's Hezekiah, no, only 2 exceptions, Hezekiah and Josiah. That's it. They are the only ones who did right in the eyes of the Lord. And that's the phrase. They did well in the eye, or they did good in the sight of God. And, you know, I don't want to get into the why of it, but even that is not enough to redeem the southern kingdom from the destruction by the Babylonian Empire, which the Deuteronomistic history will say was brought about by the sinful ways of the people and their leaders. So even the good kings were not able to forestall, they were able to forestall, but not undo or prevent the inevitable, which is the destruction of the monarchy by the Babylonians. The northern kings, who were wicked entirely, were wiped out. The northern empire of Israel was wiped out by the Assyrians in the year 722 BCE. The southern kingdom of the Judahites, the Judeans, the Judean kings, the legitimate monarchy, was wiped out by the Babylonians, or was conquered by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, sent into Babylonian exile, returned by the decree of Cyrus of Persia in the late 500s, meaning 516 or so BCE. With all that, King David tends to be held up in the Tanakh itself as the legitimate dynastic head, so that the true heirs to not just the monarchy, but the actual dynastic line that leads directly to the Messiah runs directly through King David. And that is again, I describe that as a fact on the ground. In other words, the rabbis inherit a biblical tradition that the legitimate Messiah figure will rise from the line of David. And the Christians pick that up too. Not all Christians, actually. The Gospel of Mark doesn't get into this. But the second gospel to have been written, the Gospel of Matthew, makes a very big deal about Jesus being of Davidic lineage. Interestingly, not through Mary, but through Joseph, what can we call him? Stepfather, if Jesus is born of a virgin? It's a bit problematic, but Matthew chapter 1, the Gospel of Matthew chapter 1, goes to great lengths to convince the audience, convince the reader that Jesus comes from a Davidic household. And not only that Jesus was born in the city of David, Beit Lechem, in Bethlehem. This is very seasonally appropriate for right now. Matthew makes all sorts of crazy pretzel-y efforts to get Jesus to be born in Bethlehem, even though Jesus comes from
David.
Where's he from? Jesus of
Nazareth.
Nazareth.
Nazareth is way up in the northern part of Israel. I visited there several times. Nazareth is nowhere near Bethlehem. Bethlehem is south of Jerusalem. It is a long journey. And there's a whole narrative that's invented about the persecution of Herod that causes them to leave, and they flee, and then they have to stay over in Bethlehem, and there was no room in the inn because it was Christmas Eve and all of the hotels were booked up. It's a joke. And then they had to stay in the manger and baby Jesus, right? Okay, so Jesus is born in Bethlehem because the Gospel of Matthew needs him to be Davidic, needs to convince the audience that he is the legitimate Jewish Messiah. And the legitimate Jewish Messiah is an offshoot of the line of David. The rabbis, by the way, inherit the same traditions that nascent Christianity inherits, embryonic Christianity, early Christianity, and actually have similar projects in that they too believe that the only legitimate Messiah is a descendant of David. They would challenge the fact that Jesus is a descendant of David. They would say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. His father may have been Davidic, but Joseph wasn't his father. What is this nonsense about God impregnating Mary? Like even early Jews were largely skeptical about the narratives that the Christian community was publishing around the so-called miraculous birth of Jesus. This is not anything new. But Audrey, this is the longest answer in the world to the shortest question. Sorry. But the rabbinic community venerates David and whitewashes his faults. That is consistent with how the rabbis treat a lot of biblical figures, going back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I mean, the rabbis do much in their power to whitewash the fact that Jacob was an unrepentant, that's not true. He was a repentant deceiver. But they make great efforts to say, no. Jacob was carrying out God's will, and Jacob never actually fooled his father, and it was all Esau's fault. Similarly, David becomes more and more and more kind of depicted with, as it were, a halo and wings, and less as a flawed human being who commissioned a hit on a woman that he wasn't married to so that he could steal her. Like, there are all sorts of problems with David. He is, I have often said, the Tony Soprano or the Michael Corleone of the Hebrew Bible. And the stories of the Deuteronomistic history, particularly the stories of the Davidic court and the saga of David, it's like watching The Godfather, The Sopranos. It's filled with intrigue, betrayal, power, crime, deception, lust, blood. It's the best stuff. Okay, Mom and Dad, you get to chime in here.
When you were talking about the origins of the Deuteronomic, whatever,
Deuteronomistic.
The Deuteronomistic saga here, something is jangling in my mind from a book that I read that might have been titled "Who Wrote the Bible?" I'm not sure, but isn't there a legend that Deuteronomy was found as a scroll buried in a wall by a prophet or an advisor that was actually used to rebuke the king at the current time. Am I on the right track?
Not a legend, actually. I mean, yes, in the sense that all biblical text is legend in one way or another. But 2 Kings chapter 22 tells the story of a routine dues collection or money collection for repairs to the temple that's carried out by a scribe, meaning a member of the priestly court of the king, named Shaphan, who is carrying out this scribe, and he goes to see the high priest. I think Hilkiah is the name of, which means my portion is God. And Shaphan, interestingly, means a rabbit, but okay. So Shaphan goes and he carries out this dues collection to make repairs on the temple. It's just like the building fund, or what I guess we renamed the building fund at WRT, the Campus Renewal Fund, but most of you are not new members. So you probably have long since completed your building fund commitment to WRT when you first joined. Anyway, this is the building fund, and they're going to take some money from the building fund to do repairs on the temple. And he's about to withdraw money from the temple treasury when they find buried in the walls of the temple a scroll of the law, it says. A Sefer Torah is actually the Hebrew. And they bring it, as soon as the priests see it, they immediately are they blanch, and they realize that this is something very important indeed, and they bring it to the king, and they have it read, and they all rend their clothes as a sign of mourning. And they realize that, oh my gosh, we have not been following the law of God. This happens in the court of King Josiah, whom you may recall I mentioned about 15 minutes ago as one of the two good kings of the Judean kingdom. He and his predecessor by a few generations, Hezekiah, who defended the community from the assault by, I guess it was the Assyrians in the south. He defended Jerusalem. He's the one who built Hezekiah's tunnel to make sure that they could still have water supply. He's brilliant military strategist and monarch. So Hezekiah and Josiah reads the scroll, realizes, oh my God, we've been doing it all wrong, and engages in a comprehensive program of religious reform. He abolishes all of the priests who are ministering out in the countryside, in the faraway precincts. He consolidates all worship and centralizes it in Jerusalem. He gets rid of all sorts of foreign shrines to various Canaanite and other Near Eastern deities, and the Asherot, which are these kind of sacred posts or fertility icons that were used in Canaanite and Babylonian society. He does all of these very aggressive religious reforms. And for this, the appraisal of the author of the Bible in this section that we call in the scholarly community the Deuteronomistic history gives him very high marks. He gets a great report card. And Josiah did what was right in the sight of the Lord. Even that is not enough to prevent the Babylonian conquest 2 generations later, but his children and grandchildren, his children are spared, his grandchildren will suffer. So they make it clear like he forestalled the inevitable by doing this program of religious reform, but he didn't cancel it entirely. The decree from God is, you Judahites have messed up big time, and I've got it coming for you, and I am sending Nebuchadnezzar and his armies to conquer your territory. Now, when you read the book of Deuteronomy, lo and behold, chapter after chapter after chapter describes God's instruction to engage in a program of comprehensive religious reform that to the letter looks exactly like what the book of 2 Kings reports Josiah having done during his time. Therefore, scholars have largely agreed. There's a strong scholarly consensus that the scroll that was the so-called Sefer Torah, the scroll of Torah, the scroll of the law that was discovered in the wall of the temples, in the reign of Josiah, is the book of Deuteronomy, or at least several chapters of the book of Deuteronomy as we have it today, or the original document that became the book of Deuteronomy, and that it may not have been found at all, but that it was fabricated in the court of Josiah as a way of consolidating the authority of the Judahite monarchy and priesthood. Further adding evidence to this is the fact that Josiah became king when he was 8 years old. So, as it is said, the inmates were running the asylum, right? So the king, this is a boy puppet king whose priests are enacting a program of religious reform that directly enhances the authority of the priesthood. Read the book of Deuteronomy, it all lines up. So yes, you remember very well. Norman Weiss.
You were talking before about the birth stories of Jesus. The rabbis had their own birth story, and the rabbinic story of the birth of Jesus had to do with Mary being raped by a Roman soldier by the name of Panther, and his Jewish name was Jesus ben Pantera, Jesus son of Panther.
Thank you. Yes, these stories, not surprisingly, came under the censorship and scrutiny of the Roman Empire. Did not favor the Jewish community once the Roman Empire officially converted to Christianity under Constantine. So you're right, though. Jews from a very early time strenuously objected to the purported divinity of Jesus and the Messiah status of Jesus, and the rejection of Jesus and the rejection of Christianity by the Jewish community is one of the great ruptures in the story of Jews and Christians. I mean, it is the great rupture. I think the Christians were deeply wounded that even though the original church was, of course, founded by Jews, the original disciples of Jesus were Jews. They were all Jews. What else would they have been? The original followers of Jesus were Jews. They were Jewish Christians. They were Jews who accepted the divine Messiah status of Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah. But by and large, after the original church, most of the people who would adhere to the teachings of the church were not Jews. And Jews strenuously objected to and rejected the narratives that the Christian community, the nascent Christian community, was promulgating. Later in the Talmud, Jesus is portrayed as a sorcerer and a charlatan. So thank you, Norm. Absolutely correct. Okay, next Mishnah. Let us read. So I'm bringing back on screen our story here, and I'm going to close out Haggai about silver and gold. So Mishnah 10. I mean, you can see, by the way, the Hebrew is fun here. I'll enlarge this. Chamisha kinyanim kana lo hakadosh baruch hu ba'olamo. Chamisha, we even learned this word today, chamesh, humash, 5. Kinyanim means possessions, things that you buy or acquire. Kana lo hakadosh baruch hu ba'olamo. Did the Holy One of Blessing acquire for himself in this world? Ve'eluhein, and these are they. Torah kinyan echad. The Torah is possession number 1. Shamayim va'aretz kinyan echad. The heavens and the earth as a binary construct are another one possession of God. So that's 2. Sorry, Torah is 1, heaven and earth is 2. Avraham kinyan echad. Abraham is a 3rd possession. Yisrael kinyan echad. Israel, the people of Israel, the Jewish people, belong to God. That's number 4. Beit HaMikdash kinyan echad. The Holy Temple is another acquisition. So in other words, God owns 5 things that exist in this world. 5, not spiritual things, but real things, the rabbis say. 1 is the Torah. That comes first. 2 is the world itself, the heavens and the earth. The earth belongs to God. Abraham is God's, belongs to God. Israel, the Jewish people, belongs to God, and the Holy Temple belongs to God. That's the text. Let's look at it in translation. Here they translate it as follows. 5 possessions did the Holy One, Holy Blessed One, set aside as his own in this world, and these are they. The Torah, 1 possession, heaven and earth, another possession, Abraham, another possession, Israel, another possession, the temple, another possession. 1a, This is not actually in the text, but helpfully our translator, Joshua Culp, Rabbi Dr. Joshua Culp, has given us a 1a. Okay, now we're going to prove it all. The Torah is one possession. From where do we know this? Since it is written, the Lord possessed, usually translated created, me at the beginning of his course as the first of his works of old. Try to remember back 2 weeks ago, or maybe it was the week before Thanksgiving, where we did a deep dive into the proof text that the book of Proverbs provides for the premise that a life of Torah is the life to live. There's a word in the book of Proverbs that is analogous in the rabbinic imagination to Torah itself. Does anyone know what virtue, what word above all others does the book of Proverbs extol that the rabbis associate one-to-one as meaning Torah? Every time the book of Proverbs says X, fill in the blank, they mean Torah. What's the word?
Wisdom.
Wisdom, chokhmah, right? So if you go to Proverbs 8:22, just click here, Sepharia is there for you. You can see how it lines up. I'm going back up to the beginning of the passage. There it is. It's mentioned in the first verse too. It is wisdom calling, understanding, raising her voice. So wisdom. Halo chokhmah tikra. I love this. It's the beginning of like a epic declaration of poetry. Is it not wisdom that calls out? Utuvuna titen kola. Is it not understanding that raises her voice? So this is a poetic paean, an ode to wisdom, right? I hereby extol the virtues of wisdom. She takes her stand at the topmost heights, by the wayside at the crossroads, near the gates at the city entrance. At the entryway, she shouts, O men, I call to you, my cry to all mankind. O simple ones, learn shrewdness. O dullards, instruct your minds. Listen, for I, wisdom personified, speak noble things. Uprightness comes from my lips. My mouth, the mouth of wisdom, utters truth. Wickedness is abhorrent to my lips. All my words are just, none of them perverse or crooked. All are straightforward to the intelligent man and right to those who have attained knowledge. Accept my discipline rather than silver, knowledge rather than choice gold, for wisdom is better than rubies. No goods can equal her. And we've studied that verse before. Sometimes translated, no treasure can match it, right? Her more precious than rubies. She is more precious than rubies. No treasure can match it. That's because that line is actually in the Torah liturgy. When you are in a prayer service in a synagogue on Shabbos and you put the Torah away, this verse is part of the liturgy. You say this. You put the Torah away, and as you're still holding on to it, not wanting to let go until Monday when you read Torah again, she is worth more than rubies. No treasure can match it. Yossi ben Kisma, the previous rabbi who didn't want to live in a city without Torah, would agree. Better than silver and gold. Reading on, and then you get to my fruit is better than gold, fine gold. So this is all an ode to wisdom. Verse 22 is the one in question. The Lord created me at the beginning of God's course as the first of his works of old. So the premise here becomes one of the core concepts in the rabbinic imagination, which is that even before God created the world, even before God said, Yehi or, let there be light, God looked into the Torah, as it were, as the blueprint for creation. One of the core concepts of rabbinic thought, comprehensively, you just need to know this if you're going to understand anything about rabbinic literature, is that the Torah is the blueprint for the world. And this is the proof text for that concept. So the Torah is possession of God, number one, and we know that from the book of Proverbs in the Ode to Wisdom, where wisdom equals Torah. Rabbinic proof texting takes a lot of time and effort. It's fun when you see how the puzzle pieces all fit, but you really have to put in the time to see how they make meaning. The hermeneutics of rabbinic writing. Dad and Mom?
It's, excuse me, it's a remarkable statement of the platform of our faith to say that wisdom was the precursor of creation rather than chaos. Even though God orders chaos in the creation, this is positing that there was this cosmic wisdom before. And when you compare that to other creation myths that involved rot and corpses that battled each other and decayed, this is a remarkable change in posture.
This is indeed a remarkable cosmology. Existence flows out of intelligence. Intelligence or wisdom, the divine intelligence, gives rise to the world, is an extraordinary statement of rabbinic cosmology. I do love it too. Michelle?
I take it that this is Torah writ large,
Yes.
to therefore incorporate encompassing even Talmud, from Bereshit through Talmud.
100%. And the rabbis, I think, understand Torah to mean, yes, the accumulation of all wisdom. Maimonides, kind of a significant authority on such matters, identifies God as the active intellect. We talked about this last week when Judy Gross mentioned the term prime mover, if I'm not mistaken. The idea that what set the wheels of creation into motion, or if you prefer a more modern idiom rather than wheels or gears, which was sort of the deist framework, that God is the clockmaker, of which many of the so-called founding fathers of the United States would have identified themselves with that cosmology, with that theology, God as clockmaker, deists. Even more modern would be like, what's behind the Big Bang? God's intelligence, pure God consciousness, or God's wisdom. But of course, the fascinating thing is God didn't have it. God had to get it from Torah. It's really quite, you can have a field day with this. Okay. So that's possession number one, is Torah, even before the physical creation of the world. Heaven and earth, another possession, here in the text. So where do you get that from? Oops, I knew that would happen. Okay, heaven and earth, where do you know this? Since it is said, thus said the Lord, the heaven is my throne, and earth is my footstool. Where could you build a house for me? What place could serve as my abode? That's a rhetorical question. In other words, it's all mine anyway. Like, you don't need to build a temple for me. I'm everywhere in the created universe, heaven and earth. This is where I dwell. That proves the point that heaven and earth are God's possession. It's a line from the last chapter of the book of Isaiah. And it says, it, always meaning scripture, the Tanakh. And it says, how many are the things you have made, O Lord? You have made them all with wisdom. Now you know how the rabbis understand that. The earth is full of your possessions. So a second proof text to say the earth belongs to God. From Psalms, number 3, Avraham. Avraham is another possession. From where do we know this? Since it is written, God blessed him, meaning Abraham, saying, blessed by Avram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. So even better, God is identified as the one who possesses heaven and earth, which is the immediately preceding condition. Now God owns Abraham too, through this act of blessing, from Genesis 15. Number 4, Yisrael. How do we know that God owns, as it were, the Jewish people? Israel is another possession of God. From where do we know this? Since it is written, till your people cross over, O Lord, till your people whom you have possessed. Asher Kanita. This is from the Song at the Sea that includes the verse Mi Chamocha. So it's allegedly, it is presented as the song that Moses, Miriam, and the Israelites sang when they crossed from bondage to deliverance. And one of the verses in the song is, oh, until the people cross over, O God, till your people whom you have possessed. Okay. And by the way, not for nothing, the crossing of the sea is the moment of where we become a people, where we congeal. We have a coherent national identity for the first time, or at least for the first time since Joseph's family all arrived in Egypt. But even then, I don't know if they saw themselves as a nation, even though the Torah says there were 70 of them. Now we're a nation, your people, your possession. And finally, the temple is another possession. From where do we know this? Since it is said, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established, Exodus 15:17. And it further says in the book of Psalms, and God brought them to the holy realm, to the mountain which God's right hand had possessed. And all of these use the same word, kana, kuf nun he, which means to own or take possession of. So it's a lovely 5-point proof texting for the idea that we are all God's. We, the Jewish people, Abraham, our progenitor, the temple where we worship God, the heavens and the earth, and Torah itself. We are God's possession. I sense in the inclusion of this text, building to a kind of spiritual coda, where we're going to go beyond the value propositions that have been presented in the previous many texts about a life of Torah and mitzvot. We're now going to kind of like zoom the lens out and say, ultimately, what is this all about? It is about recognizing the sovereignty of God. God as master of all creation. God as the one in whose hands we, the Jewish people, reside. Michelle Braun and then Trish.
Here I'm thinking that it is in fact intended to demonstrate once again the specialness of the Jewish people, to the exclusion of the others, because if God possesses heaven and earth, you might infer that that includes all of the other peoples,
Right.
and yet we're only going to follow us. So it's
Absolutely.
very, I don't know, nativist,
Particularistic, nationalistic, nativist. I mean, you can put a positive or a negative cast around this. I would say that there is a long story of the Jewish embrace and discomfort of the notion of our own chosenness. But it is not foreign to rabbinic thought. It is a very important core concept of rabbinic thought that the Jewish people are in a special and superior relationship in that we are the very possession of God.
and by the way, what does it mean to be a possession of God? I mean, I don't I'm not getting the concept of possession.
Well, kinyan is itself a fascinating concept in Judaism. You know, actually kinyan, this idea of possession, is the norm around which originally ketubah is written. The Jewish wedding contract is premised on the act of kinyan, of husband possessing wife. Now, remember, this comes from a time where women were more like chattel than independent beings. And it implies several obligations of the possessor to the possessed. One is protection, covenantally, like one is obliged to protect and safeguard. And that is written into the ketubah. Two, from the possessed to the possessor, obedience and loyalty. So, I mean, I could go on from there, but I view kinyan, and the rabbis would have known this as early as the Mishnaic period, as a marriage term. It's not just about property. For them, kinyan is directly associated with the marital bond. So as it were, we, the Jewish people, are the bride, and God is the bridegroom. And that is not just a woo-woo 21st century Blake concept. That is deeply embedded in rabbinic thought. It's the justification they use to include the Song of Songs in the Hebrew Bible. They say that it's actually not an erotic poem about one man's lust or one woman's lust or for another person. It's about divine love and the unbreakable bond that is like a romantic bond between God and the Jewish people. So I think that's where kinyan is most helpfully understood, as a term of possession in the way a bridegroom and bride are bonded each to the other. Trish.
I was just wondering if these are the only places where that verb is used, or if this is just another nice selective list. It's a nice comprehensive, like, list of things, or are these the only things that God possesses?
Yeah, I would have to go and see if there are other midrashic traditions, because it seems like this would be fertile ground for a whole panoply of opinions on what else does God possess. So I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me to find it in Midrash. Certainly the word kinyan, though, as I just said, is a fairly common vocabulary term in rabbinic thought that, yes, it means physical possession of an article or an item, but it goes beyond that in that it is the term used to describe the relationship of the bridegroom to the bride. But I do not know offhand of other midrashim, of other rabbinic exegeses or texts or legends that talk about God as the possessor and what other things or qualities God may possess. Okay, let's finish this text. Bringing it back on screen. So that we did finish that text. So the last one is the Holy Temple. So our final Mishnah in Pirkei Avot is short, but profound. So I will enjoy this. So similar theme. Kol, all, everything. Mashibara, these are all words you know. I promise you. I like doing this because I want you to feel good about Hebrew not being scary. Mashibara, ma just means what? All that, shibara from foray pri hagafen, created, hakadosh baruch hu. Remember, you can invert subject, predicate, object like Yoda in any Hebrew. So they don't have to go in that order like they do in English. Everything that the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One of Blessing, created be'olamo, in God's olam, lo vra'o ela lichvodo. Literally, it's a double negative. God did not create it except for God's honor. Kavod shelo. There's the word, you see, lichvodo, kavod is in the middle of it. Prefix l, meaning for, suffix o, meaning his. Possessive pronoun. So, lo vra'o ela lichvodo, God created it only for God's glory. So this is kind of like remember, this is the coda. This is the symphony is coming to an end. This is the last note of Beethoven's 32nd sonata, which is an interesting way to end his set of sonatas. But we're building something. It's more like the end of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the final statement. Everything that God created in the world, God created for God's glory. And now the proof text. So let's read it in the English. Whatever the Holy Blessed One created in his world, he created only for his glory. In other words, what is the point of everything? To glorify God. As it is said, here are two proof texts. All who are linked to my name, whom I have created, formed and made for my glory. That's a phrase that we're missing the subject, predicate, object form. We can look at that. And it says, Adonai yimloch leolam va'ed, which is a phrase you should know because it's also from the Song of the Sea, and it's the last verse of the Micha Mocha song. Adonai yimloch leolam va'ed. God will reign forever and ever. Let's look at this verse from Isaiah. Follow to the right-hand side of your screen. I'll shrink it so that you can see it. So this is Isaiah chapter 43. V'ata ko amar Adonai bora'acha Yaakov v'yotzercha Yisrael. But now thus said the Lord who created you, O Jacob. See, when you're doing a proof text, you got to go back to the beginning of the section because proof texts are highly elliptical, ... They leave out a lot. And they are kind of like a code for the bigger context that they're quoting from. So when you're doing proof texting, go back to the source, have Sefaria open or have a Tanakh by your side so you can look at it side by side. Who created you, O Jacob, who formed you, O Israel, fear not, for I will redeem you. I have singled you out by name. You are mine. Now you see we're on the exact same theme as the preceding Mishnah. When you pass through water, I will be with you. Through streams, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be scorched. Through flame, it shall not burn you. For I, the Lord, am your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. I give Egypt as a ransom for you, Nubia and Saba in exchange for you, because you are precious to me and honored, and I love you. I give men in exchange for you and peoples in your stead. Fear not, for I am with you. I will bring your folk from the east, will gather you out of the west. I will say to the north, give back, and to the south, do not withhold. Bring my children, my sons from afar, my daughters from the ends of the earth. All who are linked to my name, whom I have created, formed, and made for my glory, setting free that people, blind though it has eyes, and deaf though it has ears. All the nations assemble as one. Who among them declared this, foretold to us the things that have happened? Let them produce their witnesses and be vindicated, that men, hearing them, may say, it is true. This is a gorgeous prophecy by the prophet Isaiah. So even though you have been blind and deaf, I set you free to be my possession, all made for my glory. Everything I do for the people of Israel, I do because I'm God, and it redounds to my glory. Russell.
My question is, if everything that God makes is made for his glory, where is the line between what God makes and what we make? Is everything that we make ultimately made by God and therefore done for his glory and done in his name?
I am not sure if that conclusion is reached before the Zohar was written. The Zohar, which is the core work of Jewish mysticism, better known as Kabbalah. And yes, you can call it Kabbalah, but it's Kabbalah. Hebrew is a language where if you're pronouncing it correctly, the last syllable is typically the one to be to dominate. Kabbalah. I am not sure if that is ever stated at that, I'm not sure if that conclusion, at that degree of conclusion, is reached before the Zohar, but it is the core premise of Zohar and all subsequent offshoots of Jewish mysticism. Lurianic Kabbalah, that is to say, the mysticism practiced by Isaac Luria, the Ari, the great rabbi of Tzfat, and his followers, and certainly the Hasidic movement. The line in the Zohar, which is written chiefly in Aramaic, is as follows: Leit atar panui mine, which means there is nothing devoid of God. There's a Hasidic teaching in Yiddish which says alles ist Gott, which means everything is God. All is God. In other words, there is no experience, there is no action, there is no human agency that is not in some way a manifestation of God. All action, says the Kabbalah and its offshoot traditions within Judaism, all action, even action which appears to arise out of human volition, is actually the effluence, the ongoing flow of divine consciousness. If you are sitting in the sanctuary of Westchester Reformed Temple and you are not paying attention to the prayer book, which I totally endorse as a spiritual activity, not paying attention to the prayer book, take a moment to reflect on the verse on the ark, written at the top of the, over in Hebrew and in the bottom in English. It says, Nahar yotzei me'eden lishkot et hagan. A river flows from Eden to water the garden. I believe it's Genesis chapter 2, verse 10. I think it says that on the ark. I better know this by now. A river flows from Eden to water the garden. I promise you, we're the only shul in the world that has that verse framing the Torah. But it is the most quoted scriptural verse in the Zohar, where it is interpreted as an allegory to mean a river flows from Eden. Eden is the source of divine consciousness. The river is the flow of divinity or God's presence. Lahashkot et hagan, to water the garden. The garden is the material world. The garden is the world of human action, human beings, dishwashers and haircuts and carpools and everything, right? The world of of matter and energy in the Einsteinian formulation. A river flows from Eden to water the garden. In other words, God as pure effluence of divinity is constantly nourishing the world of action, thought, and deed. So there is no human action, there is no independent decision-making that is not somehow God acting in us and through us. Interestingly, from a completely different perspective, from a rational philosophical perspective, Baruch Spinoza, who was excommunicated for publishing these ideas, arrived at very similar conclusions. Spinoza would have called himself a pantheist, one who says that God is everything. He basically said the logical conclusion that he has arrived at is that God is everything, everything is God, and that means that his conclusion was that there is no such thing as free will, because even what you think is free will is actually God acting.
So does that mean that when Adolf Hitler massacred the Jewish people and the rest of Europe, he was performing God's will?
No, it means that he was part of the way in which God acts in the world. The idea of will is what's problematic there. As I have often said, though, the only workaround I have found for the obvious moral conundrum, and I would not be the first, my friend Shai Held, whom I mentioned earlier today, says, every time you bring Hitler into the conversation, you wreck it. Because like he makes every analogy impossible because of the extremity of his evil, which, by the way, makes it so important to condemn Ye and anyone who would take Ye to dinner. But that's different. Anyone who has good things to say about Hitler is prima facie problematic, but I don't want to get into that. My workaround, the only thing I can say that is logical, that feels true to me, that is consistent with everything I've observed, and that does not contradict my theology, is that the universe, as much as we may find this unpleasant or distasteful, is not calibrated to human notions of fairness. And that what we perceive to be the capacity for human evil is, as it were, baked into the design that God has for the universe. But I don't really believe in God as designer. I actually like this idea of as God is flowing through. In that sense, human evil is actually a little bit easier to reconcile than child leukemia. Right? I can deal with the fact that the Hitlers of the world, and Hitler is sui generis, but the really, really bad people of the world are the so-called price that is paid for the blessing, for the gift of choice, of choosing how we will act. It means that we have the choice to act in ways that heal and ways that harm. Child leukemia is harder, and that's where the universe is not calibrated to human notions of fairness comes in, because there probably is a biological evolved utility to cancer. But unfortunately, as a byproduct of that, sometimes cancer gets the wrong people, because that's biology. Like, I don't believe that God individually afflicts children with leukemia. I do believe that cancer cells are part of the evolved function of the universe, or our universe, the world we're living in right now. I also believe that the human intelligence to develop treatment for cancer is one of the great miracles of our time. So maybe we'll do a whole class on this. Judy Gross.
This sort of the discussion that has led, that is now one that's very seriously difficult to even think of, but just as we were talking about God and God is all, it's the Shema.
Yes, the mystics, the Kabbalistic interpretation of the Shema is radically different from the conventional interpretation. The conventional interpretation is, Hear, O Israel, listen up, Jewish people. Adonai Eloheinu, Yahweh is our God, Adonai Echad, Yahweh alone, meaning only this God is our God. The Shema may not be as radically monotheistic as we often think it to be. It seems to suggest that there may be other gods, they're just not ours. Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai is our God. only Adonai. That is one conventional interpretation.
And
A slightly, but the Kabbalistic interpretation is Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu, listen, O Israel, with regard to Adonai our God, Adonai Echad, Yahweh is the unity of all things. Yahweh is one capital O.
that's the one I like.
The only thing that is Yahweh, is Adonai, which, by the way, the word Yahweh is probably not the way to pronounce the divine name. Yud, He, Vav, He are all letters that don't have vowel sounds. It is pure breath.
Yeah.
That's it. In other words, the word Yahweh that we mistranslate or mispronounce as Yahweh, Yud, He, Vav, He, is just the sound of breathing, which is the sound of existence for a human being anyway. It's the closest we have to understanding what existence is the sound of our own breath.
Just one
Yeah,
quick
comment.
the word for wisdom, as we were reading them through, there was one sentence I thought that it used the word emet, truth. Is that equated wisdom and truth, or did I see something? I thought I saw something.
You may have spotted it in association. It's not an equivalent. There are several words that mean wisdom, understanding, knowledge, awareness, consciousness, and they're all used overlapping interchangeably. Not exactly interchangeably. They all have different shadings and nuances, but can be partially substituted one for the other. Emet, interestingly enough, or truth, is also an attribute that is intimately associated with God and the God consciousness. And we can get into that another time, but I'm not sure, not being able to call up the exact verse that we might have skimmed over or scanned, how it functions in that particular context. But it would be correct to say that inasmuch as wisdom is an attribute of how God creates, truth is another one. Arlene, next, please.
Jonathan, one of the textbooks that I've often referred to in my life is When Bad Things Happen to Good People, because it reformulates the way you look at God. Right. So that when something horrendous happens, whether it's child illness that we can't understand, when there's some environmental catastrophe that occurs, we don't have to look at it and say, but if God is all-knowing and he's omniscient, how could this possibly have occurred?
Right, not just all-knowing and omniscient, but also all-powerful. I mean, Kushner's main argument is that God may be all good and maybe even all-knowing, just not all-powerful. Like God actually does not have the power to stop Harold Kushner's son from dying of progeria, which is the prompting circumstance in his life that led him to write what is still a magnificent and relevant book that I still recommend and give to congregants who are going through tragic suffering. Now, having said that, the Kabbalistic, the mystical consciousness or the mystical notions around God are somewhat different. They actually don't deny that God is all powerful. They simply suggest that God is existence. God is not like the way we think, you know, we want the world to run, which is actually much harder to embrace. The notion of a world that does not deny the all-encompassing existence and power of God, in which bad things happen to good people. And that's why my workaround is not that God lacks power. My workaround is that the universe, which is another way I talk about God, is not calibrated to a human notion of what is right, fair, or good. So that may make you feel like crap. To me, it's kind of comforting. It's a bracing tonic to know that I'm not the center of God's universe. As much now, where do I struggle theologically? I don't struggle along these lines so much these days. Where do I struggle? I struggle with a line from Isaiah that we just read, which says, God loves you. That for me is much harder, right? I can get with George Harrison, who sings in My Sweet Lord, I really want to know you. I really want to see you. I really want to feel you, my Lord. But the notion that God loves me and cares about me, that is for me theologically extraordinarily difficult. I haven't gotten there yet. So mom and dad, and then we're going to read the last text.
I just love it on a day when the text kind of agrees with my personal cosmology, but if the emphasis on today's lesson is that wisdom is somehow equivalent to the divine presence, and that it actually is the same as the divine presence or preceded the divine presence, I kind of order the cosmos as a mix between order and chaos. And if we find God in the things that are ordered, and you know, it seems to me that the emphasis back from the rabbis is that in a world of chaos, the things that are ordered are the things that are divine, and that's where we find the good, in the ordered part of the universe, in a cosmos where you can say nothing makes any difference because it's all random. And this cosmology, it puts extreme emphasis on the opposite of that. It's the order that's important, not the chaos.
I love that teaching, and I find much in that theological notion that really speaks to me as well. And I jokingly say, yeah, that is a consciousness about, you know, what is good and valuable, the idea of order out of chaos, that resonates both with the biblical priests, who are all about organizing the random chaos of life. This is kosher, this is treif, this is pure, this is impure, this is holy, this is profane, this is good, this is bad. And everything gets boundaried in a way that we can make sense of life and actually have direction toward the good and the holy and the pure and the kosher, and away from defilement and destruction and chaos and evil. And it also resonates with Marie Kondo. Okay, do you know Marie Kondo? Look her up. Japanese organizational specialist. She's got some hit shows on Netflix, I think. Okay, I've been scared to watch her because then I know I'll spend the next 6 days in lockdown folding underwear. All right, so my OCD tendencies will have a field day if I ever allow myself to watch Marie Kondo. So stop me before I go there. Okay, we're going to look at the final 2 verses and then say a Shehechianu. And then next week, I hope that we can celebrate our learning together in a beautiful communal format. Let's take a look. But I will say, by the way, if you are gun shy about showing up in person, I honor that. COVID, RSV, and flu cases are all on the rise. So if you do want to show up in person, please use the best judgment you can, both for yourself and for other people. I'm aware, I even have a friend who's a doctor who has reported staff crunches at Memorial Sloan Kettering here in Westchester because so many doctors are out with respiratory illnesses right now. So if you feel like you have a little sniffle, please don't come. I love you, but please don't come. Okay. We're going to look at the very last section, which is a coda. We read Adonai Yimloch Le'olam Va'ed, and then this text really speaks for itself. And so said Rabbi Hananiah ben Akashia. You want to know who he is? You click on his name, no description known. So who was he? Where does this come from? I guess we'll never know. Just a random voice. It pleased the Holy One to grant merit to Israel. Getting back to Michelle Braun's comment about divine selection or chosenness, that is why God gave them Torah and commandments in abundance. Back to Torah mitzvot. As it is said, the Lord was pleased for his righteousness to make Torah great and glorious. What does God really want? He wants us to do what we have just spent the better part of 2 years doing, which is learning Torah together, and to make Torah great and glorious. And not just to learn Torah together, but to share Torah, and probably best of all, to live Torah. And I hope that in ways either great or even small, that this study together has increased your Torah, both as a learning and as a lived practice. I feel so blessed and so grateful to have shared this learning with you. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehecheyanu v'kiyamanu v'higiyanu lazman hazeh. We give thanks to the one who has given us life, sustained us, and enabled us to reach this moment. Mazel tov to all of you, and I'll see you next week.
Chazak.
Thanks, friends. Yes, chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. Be well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
See you well. Bye-bye.